Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Maureen Conway, Vice President at the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Institute's Economic Opportunities Program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, California's Plans for the Future of Work, Workers, and a Renewed Social Compact. This conversation is part of the Economic Opportunities Program ongoing Opportunity in America discussion series, in which we explore the changing landscape of economic opportunity in the United States, the implications for individuals, families, and communities across the country, and ideas for change. I want to thank Prudential Financial, the Walmart Foundation, the Cerdna Foundation, and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for their support of our Opportunity in America discussion series. We are honored today to host a terrific set of speakers discussing the California Future of Work Commission's recently released report, Future of Work in California, a new social compact for work and workers. We're particularly excited to be hosting this event at this time. The report considers key issues we have long attended to at the Economic Opportunities Program, particularly the challenges of inequity, economic mobility, and low quality work. And it focuses on new opportunities and challenges in the future of work, a key concern of the Aspen Institute's Future of Work initiative, which is now part of the Economic Opportunities Program. Importantly, the report frames the conversation about the future of work around the idea of a new social compact and how the institution of work can contribute to building the society of our aspirations, a question that is not just important to the Economic Opportunities Program, but to the entire Aspen Institute. In these divided and difficult times, we're renewing our commitment and redoubling our efforts towards the Aspen Institute's mission of advancing a more free, more just, and more equitable society. We've shared a link to the Commission's report in our email reminder for this event on the event webpage, and we'll share it again in the chat here so you have it. It's a terrific report outlining the present and likely future challenges for work and workers in California and laying out some bold ideas for addressing those challenges. And while, as the saying goes, California may be where the future happens first, the challenges the Commission grappled with echo all across the United States and communities all across the country. So we're thrilled today to discuss how the Commission arrived at these ideas for building a world of work in which workers, businesses, families, and communities can all thrive, and what they think it will take to turn these recommendations into action. Before we get started, I'm going to give a quick review of our technology. So all the attendees are muted. Also, please note that this webinar includes closed captions if that feature is helpful to you. We welcome your questions. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We have lots of participation we're glad to see for this event. So we'll do our best with everybody's questions. Also, we'll be sharing resources in the chat, and we encourage you to share resources and comments in the chat as well. We also encourage you to tweet about this conversation. Our hashtag is #TalkOpportunity. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, you can chat with the Economic Opportunities Program or email us at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email and posted on our website. Okay, and now I get to the part where I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have great panelists mostly with us, and one of them I hope is on her way. I will do a brief names to faces introductions. We have everybody's bio material on our website. They're really a terrific group. If I described all of their accomplishments, we'd be here all day and you wouldn't get to hear from them. So just briefly, we have James Manica, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company, Chairman and Director, McKinsey Global Institute, Co-Chair, California Future of Work Commission, and also an Aspen Institute trustee. Welcome, James. Glad to have you with us today. We have Julie Sue, Secretary, California Labor and Workforce Development Agency, and a key player in this California Future of Work Commission. Thank you for joining us today, Julie. We are hoping that Mary Kay Henry, International President, Service Employees International Union, also co-chair of the California's Future of Work Commission, will be joining us before too long. And we're delighted to welcome to moderate this important conversation, journalist and author who has been thinking and writing about issues of work and workers for quite some time, Eduardo Porter, economics reporter for the New York Times. So thank you, Eduardo, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Maureen. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here to hear you guys talk about the future of work. I've been thinking about the future of work for a long time. I've written about workers in retail, which is still the largest occupation in the economy, pondering what kind of institutional changes, tougher government regulations, heavier union representation or something, could turn them into something more than a dead-end job. I've written about home health aides and personal care aides, the fastest growing occupation in the country. These workers are pivotal to our future. As we age, many of us are going to come to depend on that kind of worker. And yet they make $26,000 a year. And their story, by the way, doesn't really quite fit into this frame of bad corporation being bad for workers, because ultimately most of these jobs are paid for by the federal government through the Medicaid program. I've written about automation, assessing whether it truly enhances business productivity or not. I've pondered, like I'm sure you have, what automation means to the future of the labor market. A couple of years ago, I went on a reporting trip to Phoenix. Phoenix has been pretty successful in building a technology-heavy ecosystem branching from its pretty large semiconductor industry. It has attracted startups from California. ASU has doubled down on tech. But you know what? Despite this success, the vast majority of jobs that are created in Phoenix are not techie jobs. They're fast food jobs and retail jobs and security guard jobs. And this presents to me one of the most important and tough questions about the new American labor market and our technological transition. Because unlike, say, the transition from agriculture to an industrial economy, which led to much more productive jobs, the process of deindustrialization that we've been going through over the past, 20, 30 years has moved large shares of the workforce into less productive jobs than their industrial forebears. So the question for me about the future of jobs is, how can you build an equitable society on these sorts of economic trends? And I hope to hear a little bit about that from you guys today. So anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about you. I find it really interesting that California is putting all this effort in understanding the challenges and suggesting prescriptions. I'm eager to hear from California because you do happen to be at the cutting edge of American innovation. You're the creators of a lot of the robots that are, whacking the industrial jobs of our past and perhaps creating the jobs of our future. But let me ask you something like really basic, taking something a step back. And I've seen, as in my writing, 24 future of work reports over the last few years. I've moderated sessions about future of work reports a couple of times before. And several of them, by the way, have been authored by McKinsey. In fact, James. So maybe a question that I think others might be interested in to hear about too is, well, what's new about this one? What new insights can you share about, the future of work and how to address the challenges? And I don't know, maybe I guess I should address this first to you, James, although, Julie, please jump in. And as part of that question, maybe you could also help us think through what's different about California. I mean, does a California setting provide any particular useful insight or angle into this question?
Well, thank you, Eduardo. Glad to be here with you and Secretary Sue. This is a wonderful opportunity. But I think you're asking a very important question. You're right. I've probably been involved in many of these future work research efforts, both at McKinsey Global Institute, but also even at Aspen and a few other places, including a few universities. I think what's different about this is the following. We started in a very different place in California. Our question was not what's technology going to do to jobs. That was not the starting point. We started the question of what is happening to work and workers in California. That was our starting position. So because of that, it allowed us to explore a whole range of issues, of which, yes, technology is one of those, but there's so many others too. There's issues of working poverty, there's issues to do with unequal access to jobs, the issues to do with the fact that different parts of our state are experiencing work very differently. So one big difference was just our starting point and the questions we were grappling with. We didn't ignore technology, but it wasn't the starting point, it was part of it. The second key difference was, and this is the thing that's been quite unique, I think, Eduardo, about this commission compared to many other things that I've been involved in, which is the composition of the commission was fascinating. The governor put together a group of people who wouldn't otherwise work together on these issues. We had labor union leaders, we had academics, we had business people. It was an incredibly diverse group of people. And I have to tell you, at the beginning, I thought, oh my goodness, this is not going to work. These people have never been around the table together to figure out these questions. Are we even going to even have a conversation about any of this? So that was unusual. That was highly unusual. And I think that I haven't seen that anywhere in some of the other commissions or efforts of this kind. The other thing and the last thing I'll comment about why it was unusual was how we actually worked. We literally spent most of our time listening to workers, listening to business leaders, listening to people who've been researching these things, and we met in different parts of the state. We literally had our meeting, so you might have thought that we were all in Sacramento hanging out with the governor. We were not doing that. In fact, we were going around the state, meeting with work and workers. So all of that, the construct was very, very different. And I think, as we'll get into in a second here, it allowed us to be able to really deeply understand what are the issues today, as well as going forward, to do with work and workers. And it's one of the things that actually allowed us to realize that we're going to have to come up with something that feels like a social compact here, because these issues are so encompassing and so interrelated. And I'm sure we'll get into in a second what some of those aspects of the recommendations were. But I think the setup was very, very different and highly unusual.
Cool. Good. Julie, I'd like to hear your thoughts kind of on this. And what was the motivation for the government now to, to ask this question and to get involved in this kind of like broad national conversation? So could you tell us a little bit more about the thinking inside government and how you chose to set it up in this way that, as James points out, is a little unusual? I mean, you've got business, you've got labor, you've got government. I mean, the three of you kind of like encompass these universes. What do you think any unique insights arose from the kind of like the tensions or the synchronicities between these different actors?
Thank you so much, Eduardo. And the short answer to your last question is absolutely yes. It also kind of goes to your question about, what makes California so special. I think the makeup and the composition of the commission really drives home the point that, our diversity is our excellence. And we really were very deliberate in putting together the members of the commission before the governor announced them, to make sure that they represented various sectors of California's leadership, California's economy, California's communities. And, as you mentioned, right, our co-chairs represent, James and Mary Kay, who were phenomenal. The rest of the commission represents everything from business and management to labor, and those who advocate for low-wage workers, tech companies and venture capital, academia, and government. And what we were looking for was not just people who had been really creative and smart in their own fields, but who could be champions and come to the table and really think about creatively about what we wanted to build, and what not just sort of, what the future of work was likely to be, but what it could be, right? The executive order was really about what work could be in the years to come. And we took that both as an analytical starting point, like what's probably going to happen, but also a jumping off point for really using our imaginations, right? Like what could it be? Because what it is not going to be inevitable. And so I think that was very exciting. The other thing that we started out very early learning that 1/3 of California workers make less than $15 an hour. And the workers of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Pacific Islanders are disproportionately represented in that low wage work population. We also talked about how 20% of those workers actually have a college degree. And so it really started to explode this notion that the problem is skills, right, or education. And of course, Dr. Soraya Kohli was on the commission too, and was incredibly powerful and insightful, talking about the role of education in the future of work. So we really approached the problem from both the standpoint of it's not inevitable, and of, if we are going to shape the future of work, we really need to be moving beyond talks about robot apocalypse and skills gaps. And the other thing that made the work different besides the composition was that it was a public body that held every meeting in a public setting where the public was invited to come. And as James already said, we're really proud that we went across the state to do that, both to encourage participation, but also to acknowledge that California is a big state with many different economies and with different communities that are affected differently. And we wanted to make sure that we heard and represented all of that. And so members of the public came to meetings and gave testimony, and we really valued that input too.
Cool. Thank you. So I don't want to belabor too much the part about process, but I would really like to hear from Mary Kay now that you're on. Hi.
Hello.
I'd really want to hear your perspective on this, because I'm thinking, well, specifically in the California context, labor and business have been just recently engaged in some pretty tense grappling over, how you define an employee in the context of gig work. And so, I'm just having that in the back of my mind. I'm thinking, okay, well, how do you guys sit down to the table and try to find common space for a common solution space, where obviously you're going to have the businesses that are at the cutting edge of this new gig economy that have some pretty radically different ideas from folks like you?
Thanks, Eduardo. One of the key things that we did as a commission is started every meeting with a question that each commissioner had to ask that gave us insight into one another's life experience. And this was a brilliant idea of our Secretary of Labor, Julie Sue. And I don't know, Julie, what the first question was, but I think it was, what work experience as a young person did you have that informed how you think about things today? It's something. And what we learned about each other is that many of the commissioners did either unpaid care work, or were children working in their parents' small business, or were minimum wage workers who had experienced wage theft, or some other live experience of workers that created a way for us to think together, not from our boxes, but as a group of leaders in California that were willing to stare in the face the racial and economic and gender inequality that is pernicious, that we all understood has existed for decades. And that if we were to think about the future of work and had the privilege of thinking over the long haul, maybe we could figure out the things that could intervene and end that inequality and close the gap once and for all. So I think it was building a relationship with each other, looking at the scope and scale of the problem together, and getting a shared analysis of the problem that James' work from McKinsey really helped inform, together with the Institute of the Future and together with the state of California. And then our willingness to listen to the life experience of underpaid workers who were welcomed on a panel in the very first convening that Julie organized, where the commissioners listened across. I think there was a warehouse worker, we had a janitor member from SEIU. And there were two other, one was a worker that was in a sort of innovative startup and felt like they had shared ownership of the company based on the policies. And it just gave you this range of worker experience that we tried to weave in through every commission meeting. So I think that kind of busted us out of our corners, is the way I would describe it.
Yeah, I would just to add one other quick thought to what Mary Kay just described, Eduardo. I think one of the things that often happens in these future work conversations, it's workers and big business, but we also, for example, spent some time listening to small, medium-sized businesses where the challenges are a little bit different, which was also just a fascinating other kind of question to grapple with. But I think many of the things you described at the beginning became very evident to us, which is even though there is work, a lot of it is low-wage work. I mean, I was stunned to know that there's something close to 7 million California workers who are in work, who live in working poverty, for example. They're working, but they just don't earn enough because of the nature of the jobs and the structure of those jobs, which is quite stunning to me. So a lot of those things were very illuminating and insightful just to hear, not only hear, but see the data. So it's a combination of hearing from workers, seeing the actual data across the state and how different that was just very, very informative.
Yeah.
And the other thing, Eduardo, just to build on that, is we were very aware that our work was not occurring in a vacuum, right? There were other things going on parallel to, in conjunction with our work. At the very first meeting, James brought up that the Business Roundtable had already been having conversations about how shareholder capitalism ought to be sort of questioned in favor of a stakeholder capitalism. So how do we look at the role of business and really stepping up to help create a future of work that is good for workers and good for the economy, frankly, and good for business too. We also, of course, had the pandemic hit, right? While we were, in really getting close to the end of the work. And so that was something that, of course, was not just unexpected, but really magnified the importance of what we're doing and forced us to think about, have we addressed what the future of work and workers looks like in light of the fact that we are now in a position to, in many ways, rebuild the economy, and how, what does that mean for us? How do we do that in a way that's worthy of the work that we've done and of the workers and the people in our society? And then I think the other piece of this context is really recognizing the opportunities that have come up, the challenges that come up due to the pandemic. So we've seen, as Mary Kay already mentioned, care work. It was no accident that such a high number of care workers got sick in the pandemic, died in the pandemic, and the fact that they were working but having to work multiple jobs to piece together life, having to go to work even when all science was saying that people need to stay home, but because there were untenable choices they had to make, it really helped to accelerate the sense that we needed to be bold and big and also concrete in what the commission did.
Yeah, thanks. Look, it's interesting from hearing what you've all been just talking about. I often these discussions about what to do to fix what ails American society. You have the people that talk about what they broadly name pre-distribution. So how do we affect the labor market? How do we affect the market distribution of incomes? And that's mostly a question about how do we, intervene in work through regulations, minimum wage things, and so forth. And then there's the issue of redistribution, which is considered kind of like after the work part. Okay, then how do we do through taxes and transfers to kind of mitigate the inequities and lift people from the bottom? And these two things are normally considered kind of separate. They are in separate conversations. But what you guys seem to be saying, and I got that point particularly strongly from a comment that James made a moment ago about the need for a social compact. I wonder to what extent you guys are thinking that these issues that you're diagnosing, low quality jobs, very low wages, a lot of working poverty, to what extent are these can these be addressed by one or the other of these components? Mm-hmm. And whoever wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to. I think you need both. You absolutely need both, because some of the pre-distributional things typically tend to go at how do you prepare people for work? How do you give them and put them in conditions and circumstances where they can work? So of course, issues to do with access to jobs, issues to do with skills and preparation, but also issues on the pre-side to do with, I can't remember which commissioner coined the term when we were working, but we ended up also looking at a whole bunch of things that we called work adjacent issues. These were issues to do with the fact that there's a whole bunch of other things that get in the way of people being able to have access to good jobs, either the cost of housing, cost of transportation, a whole set of things. So typically those kinds of things tend to be things you want to have set up ahead of time and prepare people. So you might call those kind of pre-distributional kind of actions. But you also have to get to the post, the distributional questions too, because the wage inequality, which is everywhere, of course, in the whole country, but I think is very stark in California. It's hard not to see that as you go from community to community. It's very, very striking. So I think those questions are quite real. So whether you do that with raising wages or, some of the experiments around UBI, but I think you have to get it addressing the wage income question. And especially given the issue we described earlier of working poverty, this is when you have people who are actually working, but they just don't earn enough to live. I think that's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, to my mind, that is the problem. I mean, I don't see a problem with a lack of jobs. I think we have tools to, pandemics aside, we have tools to get to full employment, but we don't yet have tools to ensure that full employment is good quality employment. So anyway, yeah. I mean, you guys, the purpose of the effort is to come out with some actual, concrete proposals about what should be done. And I wanted to get to that. Just really briefly, you mentioned that one of the objectives should be to have that there be jobs for everybody who wants one, eliminate working poverty, a better set of worker benefits and safety net protections to ensure the most vulnerable have a higher floor, more good quality jobs, and then one that I'd love that we go into a little bit further in a few moments about future proofing the labor market, which is, I think, like a really big kind of challenge that could easily take us into the realm of sci-fi. So
Eduardo, you left out a big one: job quality.
To produce good quality jobs. Yeah,
we care about that one a lot.
I think I did go through it. Okay, I'm sorry, okay. But I didn't mean to skip it. But I don't know. Maybe let me start from the beginning. This idea of jobs for everybody who wants one. And let me address this first at you, Julie. I just wrote about this, and I was reading about, kind of like from the left of the political spectrum in the United States, an idea from the Great Depression and the New Deal is kind of like right now back in order, which is a government guaranteed job. And, this idea that not only would ensure full employment, but it would also ensure good quality full employment because the government would presumably pay a good wage with good benefits, and that would set a floor for everybody else. Are you guys going anywhere in that direction, or what are the kind of like solutions? What kind of are the places that you can tweak, the margins that you can act on to achieve that?
Great. So let me say there is a part of the recommendation that is to call on the federal government for a jobs guarantee, but the bulk of the recommendation, and in line with the spirit of the work of the commission, is that it is going to take all actors to get where we want to go and where we believe we should go, and the commission's recommendations. And so the bulk of job creation is going to come from the private sector. It has to come from the private sector. And so part of our recommendations is, this call to action, right? That we want to make sure that we are clear about the roles and responsibilities of various sectors of our civil society, and also that there are ways to enact mechanisms that would help support job creation in good jobs, in jobs that help further other policy priorities that we have. So for example, one of our recommendations is a million jobs in line with California's effort to meet climate goals. And the governor here, he has already signed an executive order about electric vehicles. And there's many opportunities in all those policy goals, like electric vehicles, like affordable housing, like good transportation, like quality care, to create good jobs along with them. And then of course, what follows from the job is the workforce development and training side. But that's just a really important component of all of this, right? Which is to move away from the idea that if we just trained people more in general, that somehow we would improve their conditions and we would improve the economy. These have to be demand driven, and they have to be driven by the jobs. And then another piece of that is just making sure that when you do create good jobs, that the people who have the greatest trouble getting good jobs are actually given pathways to them. So our call is really for much more than just government to act, at recognizing that in our economy, it's going to take a lot more than that.
Yeah. No, that is, I think, a critical thought.
Sorry. One thing I'll say, because it's part of that recommendation too, is this relates to education and entrepreneurship, right? The point was also made by commissioners that entrepreneurs are job creators. So we need to invest in how we support entrepreneurs to be able to, start businesses that become bigger businesses that actually create jobs, and recognizing that entrepreneurship is a way that also communities, especially communities of color, populations that face barriers to getting employed, including the undocumented population, that they can gain a foothold in society and also build some wealth.
Yeah. What you're just saying, the skills argument really annoys me when it becomes the only bell that anybody hits. And, just thinking back to that story I did in Phoenix, you put skills in all these people, and the jobs that are there are still retail jobs, 7-Eleven jobs, and McDonald's jobs. I mean, so there has to be something on the demand for work side to complement any argument about skills. But just let me take another step, because the next two, the idea of eliminating working poverty and the idea of, establishing better worker benefits, a better safety net, I think that's a really great question for Mary Kay, because that sort of sounds to me like what your day job is about. It's, it's ensuring that the norms around the workplace and the agreements between workers and employers eliminate working poverty, presumably, and establish a good benefits. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about where you think, I guess, the more actionable, the easier bits of the challenge are, and then maybe what are the more complicated ones to get to.
Sure. And Eduardo, I understand you spoke about home health aides in the opening, and that the $26,000 a year is insufficient, and that as a nation and society, we have to figure out, are we going to value that care work in this century in the same way we valued manufacturing work of the last century? And that's a future of work shift that working people are already in. The service and care sector shift is upon us. And the question is, how do we eliminate working poverty? And I have to tell you, for me, it was absolutely chilling when this civil society table of commissioners all uniformly agreed that that should be a moonshot goal, that by 2030, California should eliminate working poverty in the state. And that if you plan out that far, what would be an intervention in the first 2 years that would give people the confidence that we could actually make it happen across all sectors of work in the state? And that's why we created the care sector as an example of what could be actionable in the next 2 years, because California invests through the in-home supportive services program, a Medicaid program, and then there's Medicare, there's private dollars, and there could be a way to think about the 1.5 million women, primarily women of color and immigrant women, a lot of undocumented women doing this work. And how do we do what you and James were talking about? It isn't simply this moonshot, but it's the combination of the other moonshots that would really situate this job as a job, the fastest growing job in the economy, and as a job that could be the foundation of the most racially diverse middle class the nation's ever seen. By thinking about what action does government, private employers, and education take together to make this job a living wage job with secure benefits. And the good news is that the Biden administration wants to invest new dollars in it that could help catalyze. It wouldn't compete with current interests. It could introduce new jobs that could raise the standard for all that work across the home care sector. And so that's why we thought about the role and relationship, as you said, between ending working poverty and creating stable benefits. We aren't, unless we have both what you and James were talking about, the work adjacent issues, but also beyond wages, secure benefits, sane scheduling that people can do, raise their families and not be in just-in-time scheduling situations, that those two have to work in harmony with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
you know, Eduardo, the irony of this particular part of the recommendation is that on the one hand, many of the people who are working these low poverty jobs or these low wage jobs, specifically care workers, but also some retail and some hospitality, have also ended up being the most adversely impacted during COVID. Because that's where many of the shutdown of activities gone. That's where they have very little in terms of safety nets and benefits. And they all earn very little. So you've got that challenge. Then the irony, of course, is that many of them are the ones we actually need for the essential work, whether it's the care work. So we kind of have, you know, this is a real moment in the sense that the people we're relying on a lot in the care sector to do a lot of the essential work that we need in this moment happen to be many of the ones who live in working poverty. Yeah. I think if there's going to be a call to action, this is it. Right? This is it. And, you know, so, and you know, from all the studies on the future of work, we know that one category of work that's going to continue to grow is in fact this service sector, but especially the care work. That's going to continue to grow. So we have to grapple with this one. That's why we thought to make it a moonshot goal, because even after the pandemic hopefully is gone, this issue doesn't go away. Yeah. It only gets bigger.
Yeah. Yeah, there is kind of like this fundamental philosophical strain between the obvious value to society of these jobs. And I can think of other jobs, you know, teachers also come to mind, and, you know, and childcare, exactly. And yet how our labor market really does not reward them to the level that to representing the value that they provide to society. But so let me,
Eduardo, I'm sorry, can I just, go. To that point, one thing that I didn't make explicit enough on this working poverty is the other kind of breakthrough agreement from my perspective that we achieved across the commission is that the mechanism of collective bargaining was a way to address the point you just made, which is the market isn't going to address that unless the workers doing the work have the power to have their own voice and agency in the design of the system and their work. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget being in the small group in Stockton when we were broken into groups to imagine these moonshots, when Roy Bahat from Bloomberg just looked at me and said, well, I just don't think we're going to end working poverty unless we encourage workers to be able to join unions. And it was, to me, a sort of signature moment in the commission of that we all started playing each other's parts in trying to think about how do we make proposals that are actually gonna, what you said, be actionable on the moonshot and get us toward the goal. And him being aware that care workers having organization to advocate as a key lever was a breakthrough in that small group.
Yeah.
I'm going to build on that just for a second too, Mary Kay. I love the sort of memories, right, that we could all share about what you asked at the beginning, Eduardo, whether there were points of kind of tension or maybe synthesis, you said, right, that led us to where we were. And I think there was a misperception when we started that somehow someone had all the ideas for the commission and we were just putting together a group of people to validate them. And from the very beginning, right, we said, we have, I knew that wasn't where the governor was coming from. And we said very clearly, no, not only is that not true, but we imagine that by bringing you all together, what we ultimately come up with after this process is going to be better than any one of us could have come up with sitting here alone or even at this time. So there should be something that changes in terms of how we think about the problems, how we think about the solutions, and even maybe, how we operate ourselves. And so it's so neat to hear Mary Kay say that. I mean, I think we all have stories about every single commissioner who engaged in that way, but I'll build on Roy Bahat, who was just so thoughtful and open from the beginning, because there was an earlier meeting, our second convening, which was held at Stanford, about technology. And I remember a conversation he engaged in with a speaker where the speaker was basically saying, really what would help is if venture capitalists at the moment that they were making their investments really prioritized worker well-being. Like, why can't we connect worker well-being to our technological, investments, what we research, what we build, what we deploy? And initially, Roy's answer was, well, our investments are made so early on that it's really hard for anybody to kind of put those guidelines in place at the time. By the end of that meeting, Roy basically said, actually, I was wrong about that. We should focus on that at the beginning because we have a role to play in ensuring that whatever is built, right, whatever we support actually advances worker well-being. And I just thought that, combined with what Mary Kay said, right, and again, there's stories about everybody. The voices of the commissioners continue to stay with me about the things that they said, like all along, the things that each person learned and how that resulted in the ultimate recommendations.
Wow. So listen, guys, what you've said has created a bunch of new questions. But I wanted to throw, there's one that came in from the audience that I want to build on a little bit. One is, which I think is very important, is what do you mean by a good quality job? And I want to just piggyback on that question of what a good quality job is to kind of like push back against the sort of optimism that I hear from you guys. And I'm sorry, I'm a journalist and I write about economics, so I'm meant to be a pessimist. But so for instance, on healthcare workers, okay? Healthcare workers are mostly paid for by Medicaid. I think it's like 75 cents out of every dollar that goes into this job come from Medicaid. So if we are going to make this a better job, better paid job with better benefits, I mean, it seems to me that this is a tax and transfer problem, but it's obviously not an easy one because we've had, I mean, this problem has been staring at us in the face for years now. And obviously there's agency issues between Medicaid and Medicare and whatnot that might make these things more difficult, but let's raise another 5% of GDP in taxes and use that to, increase the budget for Medicaid. And then but evidently this has not kind of happened. And then also on the way of, I would agree that it seems like one place to look out is unionization. But as you guys well know, unions represent what, 7% of the private sector labor force or something like that. So from there to wherever, the labor can really have a big footprint on the economy and really make a big difference economy-wise, seems like a big haul. I mean, seems like a moonshot or a star shot. And so I just wonder, I just would kind of like you to push back against my pushback here. And tell me, what are the sort of solutions that you're thinking of? And just to throw one possibility out there, for maybe specifically for Mary Kay, are you guys talking about, say, a sectoral wage bargaining where you can have it's only 7% of workers who are represented by unions, but they can negotiate for an entire sector across a full state or a full country, as it happens in some countries in Europe? I mean, are these part of the ideas?
Yes, for the care sector, especially the IHSS program covers 400,000 home care workers in California that currently collectively bargain. There's another million that are distributed against across hundreds of small businesses. Is there a way to create a multi-employer table across California that thinks about wages, benefits, education and training, the better services for the elders and people with disability that we serve in the community? Is there a way for middle-class families to buy into a public program that would reduce their out-of-pocket costs? There's lots of innovations that are happening all around the world that we, I think, have the innovation and commitment in California to try and make a national breakthrough on.
Yeah, if I could jump in, Eduardo, I think you're right to push on this one. This is not easy. Just to be perfectly honest, because even if you take, take the side of employers and businesses, for example, one of the things that I hear a lot, and to be fair, this is mostly around among larger companies, is that, many of them would say they'd like to raise wages, but I don't want to do it on my own. I'd like my competitors to do the same thing because I operate in these markets that are very competitive and the margins are so thin. If I unilaterally do it, it's hard. Could we all do it together? Could we somehow either through a compact or a set of incentives do it together? I think that's a little bit of what you're starting to hear even from large company organizations like the Business Roundtable, for example. So while that might work for those very large companies, there's a group of employers where this becomes very difficult. These tend to be the small and medium-sized businesses because for them, it's much harder because they don't have the cushions, the scale, or even the balance sheets and right to do what large companies do. So the small, medium-sized businesses, which by the way, employ a fair number of these low-wage workers, either in hospitality or retail, as well as even care work. I don't mean care workers in the hospitals necessarily, but care work, home health care and home care and other kinds of care. This becomes very difficult for small and medium-sized businesses. That's why I think at some level, there needs to be some collective action, whether it's at the state level or probably even better at the federal level, to say, this is a collective problem. How do we think about the kind of incentives we create? One of the things that I've always felt is an under-leveraged part of our incentive systems for companies is we've created all these incentives to encourage companies, for example, to invest in capital, to invest in, we allow them to depreciate capital, to invest in R&D, which is wonderful. And we should keep doing that because it's great for the economy, great for innovation and productivity. But the scale of incentives aimed at human capital pales in comparison to the kind of incentives we've put in place to encourage companies to do the right thing for workers. I mean, even Aspen's own future work initiatives has actually pointed this out, that, what if we actually went at the set of incentives that we put in for companies to encourage the right kind of behavior. So I think you're right to push on this one. This is a very complicated one, which is why in our minds, at least in the commission, we wanted to put out a moonshot goal, knowing that there isn't a simple silver bullet answer this year or next year, but what if we imagined what the future could look like in 10 years? And let's all work very hard to try the kinds of experiments, initiatives that Mary Kay is describing that are very targeted to see what we learn from that and what we can scale for that, around that. At the same time, working these other levers to see if we can get to a very different outcome within a decade.
Yeah, Julie, to this point, I wanted to ask you, because you talked about, you took some hope from businesses realizing the importance of their stakeholders, of their workers, and so on. And I wanted to tie that in with what James just said about the role of incentives, or you could also call it, regulations, or the whole array of tools that governments can use to sway business behavior versus business goodwill or business realizing that the world that they live in is not optimal. And I'd love to hear your thought about to what extent should we trust things like, I don't know, CSR, which I'm super skeptical of, and to what extent it's like, change the depreciation rules so that, they can't, the incentive to put in more machines isn't as great. And, how do you balance those two ideas?
Yeah, thank you, Edward. I mean, it's a yes and, right? It is a, there are many different approaches to what is, probably like the biggest challenge of our time, which is how are we going to, create a world, an economy in which everybody shares in security and what's good about it. And I think that this goes back to the quality job question, right? Which is we have these moonshots, like what you said is true. Many of these things are hard, and that's why the goals, the recommendations are set out for 10 years. But I think it was Carla Javits and Controller Betty who came up with the concept of, if we're going to have moonshots, we also need rockets, right? So we also need the things that are going to carry us there. And the commission thought long and hard about what those rockets would be. And so I think those rockets run the gamut from, voluntary. We want people to step up and do better and show how it can be done better. They also have, as the state, right? We want employers who do right by their workers to know that the state is on their side. So how do we help do that? How do we incentivize that more? So procurement is one obvious tool for that, right? If how we use public dollars, what we subsidize through public dollars sends a message to, and it's very important. That can help to incentivize. And then we also have in there, right, that there is a need for, for enforcement, right? We need to make sure that the standards we do put in place are enforced. I will say that one thing about the job quality question is we don't know how we're doing if we don't measure it. And so that's why one of the recommendations is really about rolling up our sleeves and coming up with what is a job quality index that we could that we can measure our progress by. And at the same time, can we create a California job quality incubator where we are looking at ways to move us toward better jobs. And then to Mary Kay's point, I was going to say this earlier too, I think one of the points of consensus was that workers have to have more power in the workplace, and part of that power is the ability to form a union. And so all of these are part of the solution. And we were very clear that we didn't expect the report to cover everything either. So the next step is really to go out, engage with Californians about what does this mean to you? What role will you play? And that runs everything from our, fantastic philanthropic community, which was so key to funding the Institute for the Future in going on this journey with the commission, to unions and worker centers, to educational institutions, right, to workforce boards, to businesses of all sizes. So it really is a call to action in that way.
Cool. So I think this is the moment where I open it up to some questions from the audience. There's some really interesting ones. And so the first one, which is very popular, is could you talk a little bit more, I don't know who wants to take this one up, but about the regional differences that you guys uncovered across the state when you were looking at conditions across the state?
Sure, I don't know if you want to take that, Julie, I'm happy to.
Go ahead, James, I'll build on you, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that we did look at in California, right, if you look across California's counties, whether it's you look at job growth, wage patterns in each county, access to jobs, there's enormous variation, quite frankly, right? Because if you're in the Inland Empire, for example, the questions of access to jobs are very, very different. So one of the things we found ourselves grappling with is that this issue of we called it inequality of people and place. I mean, there's clearly inequality of people, whether it's social income groups, race, gender, and so forth. But this difference of inequality of place was very, very striking. And some of these places are not very far from each other. I remember one of our meetings that we had in Stockton, which arguably is not too far from San Francisco, but boy, how was it different. Yeah. And boy, were the issues very different. Yeah. And that's not even that far away. So I think this question, then this gets you at question. So what do you do with these regional, local differences? Is it about creating incentives or encouraging companies to open offices there? We actually think, by the way, COVID might have expanded our solution space here a little bit in some ways, just given some of the in-state movement that we're starting to see and people working in very different configurations. But I think this question of these differences was very, very striking. By the way, this is endemic. This is not that different from what we see across the country, by the way. I think I might have mentioned in an earlier conversation, Eduardo, we've done some work. We literally looked at every one of the 3,149 counties in the United States. And you see, again, these micro differences, even in the same state. So in that sense, California is not different from the rest of the country. But boy, is it quite striking. I think this also then calls for very different sets of solutions, if you like, or toolkit to use, or rockets to use Julie's language, to address some of these regional differences.
Julie, do you want to take it on, or should I move to the next question? Here's another really good one.
Okay, go ahead. I can.
Okay, here, this question is whether you guys considered employee ownership models. Are they part of the solution? To what extent, like, cooperatives and so on could be considered as part of a strategy to improve the quality of work and mitigate inequity?
Yes, exactly. Yes. So we do mention, sort of other forms of work, right? And how we can make sure, again, that workers are not only in situations where they're reliant on income, but also on how we build wealth, right? We talked quite a bit about how income is only one of the gaps. The wealth gap in the state and in the country, frankly, is even broader when you look at racial inequities and multiple other forms of inequity, including your question about place. And so, yes, to that as a solution. Again, this seems like a good time to mention. There is, we don't want to be overly sanguine about where we are, right? Like this is, there are millions of people who are still unemployed. There is the devastation to the economy due to COVID that has accelerated other forms of devastation. And I think that there are, as James already mentioned, as we talked about a lot with the commission, people who are still working but still not secure, right? Not income secure, not secure in other ways. And so we know that the challenges are really really large. We also were able to, through the life of the commission, hear from people who were doing innovative things in their space to address that. So that included work, for example, specifically in the Inland Empire, or we went to Stockton and heard from Mayor Tubbs. And there, I think building on some of those innovations is very exciting to us. So there are people in California who are doing really exciting work around cooperatives and employee ownership. And there are people doing things around, we heard from the Job Quality Fund, which, sort of inspired this idea that if there are other ways of supporting employers who are doing the right thing, maybe even to give them an initial support to do something that then has its own, benefits, right? So that the employers can then take them on and expand on them, whether it's just purchasing a piece of new equipment or setting up a program for upward mobility in your workplace. There are just innovations like that we think should be looked at as part of the solution. I see James wanting to jump in. James.
Yeah, I was going to add, Julie, to that. One of the things that links this job quality point and index that Julie is talking about with also the other priority that we had, Eduardo, about future-proofing California. We haven't talked much about this, is, even before the pandemic, we were already thinking about how do we future-proof California. And in that moment, we largely had two things in mind. We had the impact of technology in mind, and we had climate change in mind, partly because we know those things are quite real. And if you live in California, they're very real, and they became very real over the last few years in very stark and painful and tragic ways. But I think the pandemic opened our eyes to the possibility of future health crises as well, because it's not as if this is the last and final pandemic. So if you take these three big ones, if you like, impact of technology, climate, and maybe even future and ongoing health challenges, one of the things we very quickly realize is that some of the work to prepare for those things often also involve creation of jobs that are actually good anyway. So think about preparing for climate change. We're going to need to build new kinds of infrastructure, new kind of adaptation, and much of that work itself is actually mostly quite fairly often associated with good quality jobs. So by doing the work we're going to need to do for the future, while also preparing the state, we hopefully could address both job and work quality issues, but also at the same time, quite frankly, help the state and people in California prepare. So there's a wonderful kind of confluence if you look at that fifth recommendation, where we had some very specific ideas. I should also mention one of the things that many of us on the commission didn't want to lose sight of is the impact of technology is more than just automation. We also have issues about data in the workplace. We have issues about how do we think about protecting workers when data enters the workplace in all kinds of ways. So we spent some time on those issues too. We won't have time to get into it now, but that was very much on our minds and built into our work.
Well, and to build on that, there was also the technology as a form of like surveillance, right? Technology as a form of worker oppression, and how do we think about and disrupt that? One last thing I just wanted to say to your earlier question too, Edward, about kind of government's role and jobs and job quality is, we had Carla Javits on our commission who was very, consistent in reminding us about the workers who are most likely to be left behind if we're not intentional about it, right? Workers who face multiple barriers to employment, they've been formerly incarcerated, homeless or precariously housed. And there are things in place that help to address that. The employment social enterprises are a way that people who otherwise are working to get into the job market can actually get a job, and many of those are supported by government contracts, for example, right? So I think that we're able to really both think at a high level about ideas, but also dig in deeply enough to see what solutions are being tried and tested, and are there things that we could scale to help meet the recommendations and the goals that we have. So we're not really starting from ground zero, and that goes back to your initial question about what makes California special. I think we were very heartened to hear from all across the state things that people were doing to try to address these issues, and we tried to be true to that in the recommendations too.
Thanks. A really great question came in, and I'd love to hear Mary Kay and take on this, and Julie as well. It's the about immigrant work. And immigrant work is a big part of the labor force in California, but it's also a significant part of the labor force across the country. How do the idea of the rights of immigrant workers, and very importantly, undocumented workers, feature in your thinking? How does this substantial part of the workforce feature into your thinking? And I know SEIU has been one of the most innovative, I think, unions out there trying to, organize and represent and advocate for these workers. I'd love to hear, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about how this part of the labor force fits into your overall analysis.
It's part of the findings, Eduardo, about what's the problem, included an analysis about California's both benefit from immigrant work and what immigrant workers contribute to the economy, and the structural barriers that are created because of their status. And I think all of us started the commission at the height of the child separation policy unfolding on the southern border, I think, as we convened, and the sort of cruelness of our national treatment of immigrants that's been escalating was in our face throughout. So I think undocumented workers were thought about in every one of those moonshots. That's one. Two is the COVID crisis and the lack of access for undocumented people to access benefits that were coming from the federal government, and then the state government trying to intervene by opening access through special allocations of money that philanthropy matched, to me was an example of how we were trying to do a workaround the structural problem that we have in the nation. And so everything that we discussed, place, the number of undocumented in Stockton and Fresno and Bakersfield, and the degree to which that inequality was wider than in any other place in the country between those communities and the San Francisco Bay Area, I remember was a dagger to my heart, thinking, oh my God, right here in California, we have the grossest economic and racial inequality of any place in the nation. And so this question you're posing about, therefore, how do undocumented workers and their families get access is a combination of all these interventions, but ultimately, I believe creating the power necessary to fix the broken immigration system so that workers have access. And I would say that the presence of the pandemic and the experience of 1 in 3 people being infected in the LA community was emblematic of, if we don't think about how we're all in this, if that wasn't a clear case for how we're all in it together, I don't know what is. And it raised the consciousness and the urgency, I believe, of trying to intervene on behalf of that community, because it's in all of we can't restore the health of the state or our communities unless we are targeting the access that's required for public health, economic, and racial equity to the undocumented community.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little to add to Mary Kay's description of that, except I will say that, I think when it comes to immigrant workers and specifically undocumented workers, we really see the gap between policy and reality, right? I mean, here in California, there are explicit labor, there's a labor code section that says that your immigration status is irrelevant to your protections under the labor laws. But the reality for workers, especially given what Mary Kay has described as, both by rhetoric and priority in the past 4 years, has really been devastating and made COVID even more devastating. The only other thing I'll say is that sometimes our policies fall short too, right? So this came up in the conversations we had at the commission too, that there are explicit ways in which the undocumented are excluded from certain protections and safety nets. And so we have a recommendation in the report about really taking a hard look at whether our safety nets are sufficient. But certainly what we've seen in COVID is, undocumented individuals are not entitled to unemployment insurance. So when you have massive pandemic-induced unemployment, what happens in that situation? And governments and philanthropy and organizations and unions have stepped in the breach, but that is a really big breach.
Yeah. So listen, I wanted to ask, we're coming to the close here, but I want to squeeze one last question in for all 3 of you, which is, what's the first priority? What's the number 1 policy or change in practice or, thing that moves us on to this better path that we want to be on?
Well, I'll start to say, it's also just an opportunity to say thank you to Mary Kay and James, who are our co-chairs and who stepped up just magnificently. I would say, I think what the commission would say to that is that we have 5 priority areas for a reason, right? Which is that every single one of them is critically important. In many ways, they reinforce each other, right? So we recognize from the very beginning that you can't do one thing without trying to do other things. But we were also very careful about not going so big that there was nothing concrete in what we recommended. So I'll punt to say, I don't think we can prioritize among the recommendations and the priority areas, but I will also say that is a perfect question for the people who are listening and for the people that we hope to engage, because the idea was always that this report would not be here's what we need from government, or here's what we need from any one sector or any one actor. It really was can we spur ideas that move people to action around really big goals and a vision for what we want the world to look like. And so that's really how I think we would answer the question about what's the number one goal, is to get everybody engaged in doing something to further the recommendations.
She's our Secretary of Labor, and we're sticking to that answer.
I'm with Madam Secretary too on this one.
Great. Well, I just wanted to come in and close this out. Thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation. You've given us lots to think about and to hopefully go out and act on. So really, really appreciate all that you've shared today. I also want to thank my many Aspen colleagues who helped put these events together. It is a huge team effort, and many thanks to my colleagues for all that they do to bring these events to you. Thank you to the audience. This is terrific, great audience participation. You had great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but please do take a moment as you leave to fill out our feedback survey. We love to hear from you. Let us know what you thought and what you'd like us to talk more about. And thanks everybody just for spending time with us today, and we hope you'll come back and join us again soon.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Mary Kay.
Thank you all.